Welcome to Detoxicity, a podcast that aims to reframe the narrative around masculinity by way of sharing experiences and stories. If you're looking for one of those alpha male podcasts that isn't centered around things like inclusivity and vulnerability, you are in the wrong place. Or maybe you're in the right place if you recognize that the Joe Rogans and the Red Pills of the world shouldn't be the norm. Anyway, I'm Mike Joseph. I host and produce this show, and I'm happy you're here. We are closing in on 5 years of this podcast, and I appreciate all the support I've received and would love to thank everyone who's been a guest now and in the future for allowing yourselves this space to share your story. If you'd like to know more about the guests, I suggest following them on social media. I usually mention where you can find them at the end of each episode. You can follow me on Instagram at DetoxPod. You can request a free coaching consultation from me at mike-joseph.com. And you can support Detoxicity by spreading the word to friends, by liking and commenting on whatever platform you're using to listen, or by becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/detoxicitypod and subscribe for as little as $3 a month, and you will get early access to episodes. I'll even send you a cool DetoxPod fridge magnet. Thank you for listening, and enjoy this latest episode. I am really happy to bring you all my first recorded conversation with Tom Gentry for this podcast. Um, I say first recorded conversation because Tom and I, after meeting on, I want to say it was Instagram, probably about a year ago, have had many conversations via the phone and the internet in that time since. So, Tom is a wonderful, wonderful human being. He also hosts a podcast called The Path to Authenticity, also on Substack. You should check his Substack out. And he is a coach and a counselor. He has worked in the realm of addiction largely, but not solely. He has been a substance abuse counselor. He is a coach primarily for men. And a lot of the stuff we talk about is fairly well trod on this podcast, but also everybody's individual perspective brings something new to this conversation, right? So even though we talk about some of the same things over the past nearly 200 episodes, everybody brings something fresh and unique and authentic to these conversations. And I say that knowing that I actually say over the course of the podcast that authentic has turned into an overused buzzword. But here, I want to say we mean it in the most, you'll get this, authentic way possible. Anyway, me and Tom talk about everything from emotional intelligence and how that should probably be what we term toxic masculinity as in terms of the lack of emotional intelligence. We talk about how toxic masculinity has kind of been given, I don't want to say a bad rap because it is definitely something that needs to be talked about, but is sort of been misconstrued in the public conversation. So we talk about redefining what that means. We talk about family a lot and how the way that we grow up influences the way that we exist as adults. And a lot of times we have to unlearn a lot of the things that we've been taught by our elders and our parents. And we talk about his story and what got him to the point, A, where he became an addict, and B, where he needed help, and C, how he got help. So this is a great conversation. It's very full. Tom is an awesome guy. I hope that you get something out of this. Here's Tom, everybody.
Okay. I'm Tom Gentry. I am a 52-year-old white male living in the Midwest. I am a husband. I'm a father of a 19-year-old son who's in college in Boston. I am a man in long-term recovery from alcoholism. And I'm a substance abuse counselor who's been working in that field in one way or another for about 25 years. And as a profession, I function as a sober coach, a family coach, and what I call a transitional coach, which is I work with mostly men to help them navigate significant changes in their lives. And usually that's something like a divorce or a breakup, or like right now, I have a client who's in a new relationship and he doesn't want to screw it up. So that's me in a nutshell.
Here's a question. Do all of the other sort of modules that you work in, is that all through the lens of sobriety? Like, is everybody that you work with in recovery?
No, no. I also do a men's group once a week. It's been meeting on Monday afternoons virtually for about 5 years now. And although it started out as men in early recovery, or maybe what I'd describe as second stage recovery, where they kind of have the abstinence part down, but they still need to learn how to manage their internal lives, and they need to learn how to better navigate relationships, close relationships. So sometimes about half of those guys are men in recovery from a substance use disorder. Others are people who maybe they found their way to me because they had a family member who I worked with or something
Mm,
like that. But it's usually a relationship issue, and usually it's related to codependency.
got it. How did you end up being in this work?
Well, I nearly drank myself to death when I was 23 years old. I mean, I grew up in a home where I'm the youngest of eight, two older brothers, five older sisters. And it was pretty acceptable for the men in my life to be drunk several times a week.
Hmm,
So one of the dots I connected as a little kid who wanted to be close to the other men in his life was they all drank. And so if I was going to be close to them, I needed to drink too. And so one of the ways I've described it is I started down that path in pursuit of love,
hmm.
really, and trying to connect with the people who I cared about. And it never really worked. You know, don't even really remember how old I was when I took my first drink. Too young to remember. I started drinking regularly in high school and several times a week by the time I was a senior in high school, and really kind of crossed that invisible line into alcoholism when I was about 19 years old.
What's interesting to me, or something of many things that's interesting to me, is I wouldn't say I necessarily grew up in a drinking household. The men in my family did enjoy a couple of beers now and then. I don't remember seeing the majority of my male relatives intoxicated, although I can't say I also really knew what intoxicated was at that point in time. But I remember being like 5 or 6 years old, and I was raised by my grandparents, and my grandfather loved his beer, and I remember asking him to taste it, and he let me taste it, and I thought it was the grossest thing in the world. And this is the 80s where it's like just say no and all this other stuff, and you hear about drunk driving. And I was super duper goody two shoes guy, and I was like, oh man, I'm never gonna have an alcoholic drink, never gonna drink alcohol. And even in high school, most of my friends did not drink. Growing up in New York, the culture isn't to go to house parties and have beers and do all that stuff. I only saw that stuff in like teen movies.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until I graduated high school and I was part of the workforce. I started working pretty much immediately after I graduated full time. And what everyone would do to blow off steam after work was go to the bar. And I think that's when my relationship with alcohol really started as, I mean, not a drinking age adult, but like an adult.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always interesting to hear these stories of people who've been drinking since they were early teenagers, just because that experience is so different from mine. And the whole like
Mm-hmm.
get drunk at high school parties experience is so different than mine. But I think that maybe a city thing as opposed to a suburban or rural thing more than anything else.
Well, culturally, where I grew up, Kokomo, Indiana, it's not New York City. There's not a whole lot going on. So there's high school basketball and football. And I mean, there are probably as many bars in this town as there are churches. And the home I grew up in, there were one, two, three, four, about 6 bars within about 3 city blocks of where I lived in a
Wow.
town of 50,000 people. So, yeah, one of them was my uncle's. And when I got into the workforce and was old enough, started showing up there at the end of the day every day, having a couple drinks, and sometimes staying there until it closed down, even though I meant to only have a couple drinks.
So,
So,
so did you just end up in a drunk tank one day, or was there an accident, or what was the breaking point for you?
so had this messy relationship about a year before I got sober, and I was drinking way too much and trying to save that. And I went to a local treatment facility, an outpatient program, and lasted about 50 days before I drank. And then over the next about 9 months, really spun out of control. I joined the Carpenters Union a couple years after I got out of high school, and I was in the 3rd year of an apprenticeship and was working for a hardwood flooring contractor that we were putting floors in Eddie Bauer stores. So I had spent a couple weeks in downtown Chicago on like 3 different stores on Michigan Avenue, and we ran out of material. And so I got sent home waiting for a delivery from Canada. And the whole time I just stayed drunk. And that's kind of what I was doing at that point, just still living with my parents, making pretty decent money, squandering it all, staying drunk as much as I possibly could. And they were becoming less and less tolerant of it. And meanwhile, I had this sister who lived in South Florida who was kind of the alcoholic in the family, and she'd been sober for a year. She had liver problems, and her doctor referred her to a treatment facility in West Palm Beach. And so when I really started to spin out of control, she wanted me to have that same experience as she had. And it really was noteworthy to me because I only knew her as kind of a mess. And
Mm,
here she was sober and really, really happy. And that was sort of the key message that she conveyed to me, was that you don't think you can be happy, but you can be a lot happier, actually. It can be a really great life. So in spite of all that, I ended up talking to a guy in the admissions department at this place, and but wouldn't really follow through. And sort of the last day of my drinking, my sister, who also lived with my parents, was kind of freaked out, and I was just laying in my bed drinking whiskey and at 23 years old. And so I wouldn't respond to her when she would talk to me. I just wanted her to leave me alone. And so she kept calling paramedics. So an ambulance showed up at my mom and dad's house like 4 different times that day. And they would come and they'd say, Tom, you want to go to the hospital? And I'd say, nah, I'm good. And then they'd come back. And finally, like the 4th time, I went with them. And so I end up in this emergency room, which was the hospital associated with this outpatient program I went to. So didn't really have a great experience there. Didn't want to go back there. And a story I really love to tell associated with this is, when I was a kid in 3rd or 4th grade, the teacher was going around the room one day asking us all what we wanted to be when we grew up. And there was this little girl, Angie Lee, who raised her hand with all this pride and said, I'm going to be a doctor. And all through high school, we were in gifted classes together. Like, I was a pretty good student, and we were kind of on parallel paths in life. And I end up on a gurney in this emergency room, and in walks Angie Lee, who's on her
wow.
residency, saying, Tom, what are you doing with your life? And I just kind of knew it's over now. I'm not doing this anymore. Whether it's God or an angel or whatever you want to say, still refused to stay at the hospital. So at that point, I blew like a 3.9 an hour after my last drink. Like, that's dead practically, right?
Wow. Okay.
And so they told my parents, don't take him home. Like, he'll go into a coma or something. But I refused to stay. So I got in the back seat of my dad's Lincoln, and he went back inside. This is 96. This is before everybody had cell phones. So he goes back inside the hospital. I stay there with my mom, and he called the police. And they rolled up right next to us and told me to get out of the car, and they arrested me for public intoxication.
Wow.
So I spent the night in jail and woke up the next morning. And before that, I was particular about where I wanted to go, if I was going to go anywhere to get help. And I called him about 7 o'clock that Saturday morning and said, I don't care where I go. I just need help. And by about 2 in the afternoon, I was on a plane to West Palm Beach, and I haven't taken a drink since then.
So it was that immediate. It was just like rock bottom, and then that's it.
You know, I didn't want to live that way, man. It hurt really, really bad, first of all. And also, I knew I was capable of things. I wanted to have a life, and I knew I wasn't going to have it that way. I mean, there's nothing I've experienced that's more terrifying than wanting to not drink and then drinking against your will. It's, oh my God, it's the most terrible feeling. And I just remember like holding it in my hand and not being able to stop myself from putting it to my mouth. It's just scary. And so part of it is I was really scared. And part of it was I wanted to survive and I had aspirations. And I got really, really good treatment. And I'm where I met staff members, men who were healthy and happy and who didn't drink. And they were laughing and having fun. And I liked them. I could see myself hanging out with people like them. And so something clicked and I knew I can do this and this can be a lot better. And there was also this conviction that I had that there were so many alcoholics in my family. This is where it ends. I'm not doing this. If there's anything I can do about this, this is where it ends. And it's been 28 years now. I've been able to help some family members get sober. And
I love that.
slowly over the last couple decades, there is a small army in my family of sober men.
That's fantastic. One thing that well, multiple things that I don't think people really get. One is the compulsion. The, eh, you know, I understand willpower and free will and all that stuff. And I don't think that I'm addicted to anything in particular, but I do understand when you really, really don't want to do something, you don't want to repeat a behavior, whether it's like a mental health cycle or a substance cycle, or whether you don't want to, I don't know, whatever you don't want to eat particular foods. Actually, that's probably how I understand it most as a diabetic who still
Mm.
feels compelled to eat food that's not good for them. You can have all the willpower in the world, but addiction doesn't work in a way where you can just like be like, I'm gonna stop and then just stop.
Yeah. I mean, I had to be stopped. And I think that's really what makes the difference between someone who's an alcoholic and someone who's not. And if you haven't experienced it, you just don't get it. Like I was telling somebody in the last day or two, this really good friend I had who at the end of my drinking was just like kind of tired of dealing with me, kind of tired of being stuck driving me home from parties where I was a total mess. And he told me one night, I'm not going to do that anymore. And, of course I felt ashamed. And one of the things he said is, why don't you just not get drunk? And it sounded like the weirdest thing I ever heard. Like, why would I not get drunk? Just made absolutely no sense to me at the time. Now it does.
Right,
And there was a time when I could have a couple beers or whatever. I was not old enough to drink at that time. But yeah, there is no willpower if you're really an alcoholic.
right.
And, once you stop, though, once you achieve sobriety, achieve recovery, then it becomes a conscious choice. Like now I have a choice. I could pick up a drink if I wanted to, but I don't want the results. So I
Right.
don't.
Right. And I think another thing that people don't really understand is that so often it's hereditary behavior or learned behavior. Again, whether it's alcoholism or substance abuse or overeating or sex addiction or
Mhm.
whatever it is, these are things that I don't know that a lot of people fall into these behaviors unless they have prior examples.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the men around me, that's what they did. And there were a few of them, like extended family members, who were clearly alcoholics. My youngest brother, who's about 8 years older than me, I mean, I went through high school promising myself I wasn't going to be an alcoholic like him, and really thought I wouldn't. Really believed that I was just capable of not doing that because I didn't want to. And maybe if I didn't drink, that would have been one approach, but that was never a possibility I even entertained.
Right.
So I think a lot of people think about alcoholism, addiction as hereditary, and they say there's a genetic component. And I don't not believe that. But to me, one of the things, well, first of all, I learned as a man in recovery, if I'm going to stay in recovery, I have to keep growing. It just doesn't end. And so I understood that, and I committed to that way of life where I continue to grow as a human being. But, you know, I was doing this work. There's a 12-step program for people from dysfunctional families. And that's kind of where I'm at right now, is working on all that stuff. And there's an exercise where you do a genogram and you kind of label the family members, like what dysfunction they had.
God, I
And
don't want to do
I
that.
mean, I went all out. I went all out. I got a big poster board, used different colors and shapes for the genogram. And once I did that and I looked at it, I thought, it would have been a miracle if I didn't become an alcoholic. And that wasn't because of heredity. That's because of what I witnessed and what was acceptable in my world. Like, for my older brother to go to my uncle's bar and to show his ass and get barred for several months, and to not be able to drive home, and my cousin who ran the bar take his keys and call somebody, and somebody's got to go pick him up. That was just kind of normal in my family. That happened. It wasn't strange to me.
Right.
And now I know that's outrageous behavior. That's crazy, right? But it didn't seem crazy to me as a kid. So, yeah, I mean, so another way to describe that is crazy was normal.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that falls into the whole learned behavior thing where it's like
Mm-hmm.
the stuff you grow up witnessing gets normalized to you and you end up inevitably repeating some of that behavior. So you make the step, well, you're in recovery. Do you then make the step from being in recovery to helping other people? And also, how do you make the step from doing carpentry to helping people? I feel like that's the bigger step than being in recovery and helping people.
Well, I was never a carpenter. I'm not a carpenter. I've always been a writer. As a kid, I wanted to play baseball, and I was a pretty good athlete as a kid. That was my real dream. But I grew up in a home where if you want to be a musician or an artist, or which they kind of lumped writers into that category.
Mm-hmm.
Even though as a 16-year-old kid, I was published in the local daily newspaper. And by the time I was 19 or 20, I was covering high school sports, and I could clearly do it and make a living doing it.
Right.
But they just kind of looked at it like, well, what are you going to do? Work at McDonald's and flip hamburgers so you can write? Why don't you get a trade? Everybody always needs a plumber or a carpenter. And really, I was so stuck in fear, and I was so inhibited by this desire to prevent their abandonment of me, is a way I would put it. I needed their favor. I needed to keep them happy, or else I couldn't feel good about myself. And what they saw as possible for me in life was based on what they'd seen in their life. They had no idea what I was really capable of and what my life could become. And so I was afraid to leave that little bubble. Like, I had a friend at one time who said to me after high school, why don't we just go to New York and live in New York? The two of us, we could afford to do it together. We could. And I was like, I don't want to go to New York. Why would I want to go to New York? I can't go to New York.
Why
Like,
wouldn't anybody want to go to
it
New York?
seemed like going to Mars to a kid in central Indiana.
Sure.
And so, yeah. So, long story short, I sold myself out and became a carpenter. Didn't even try to go for it in life. And that to me was because I had a deficiency in self esteem because of the atmosphere I grew up in. I wasn't nurtured the way that I deserved to be, and every human being deserves to be. So I sold myself out. And the way I understand my alcoholism now, and kind of always have, is that it was really an existential crisis. Like, I could not bear the pain of not being my true self. And so eventually, back in 2019, I started this podcast called The Path to Authenticity because I wanted to do an interview podcast and I wanted to be able to leverage the relationships I made in this career in addiction, having met a lot of authors and really brilliant people, but I didn't want it to be just about addiction. So I really started to think about, well, what is this really about? And that's how I arrived at the concept of personal authenticity, not because it became a buzzword shortly after that,
It
but,
did.
but because addiction really is a betrayal of self, and it's avoiding yourself.
Say
And
more.
it might not always start that way. It might be the kind of thing where you're partying and you're having a good time, and then eventually you're addicted, and then you keep doing it. But I believe deep down, when we're in that place, we know we're better than that. We know that that's no way to live. We know we're capable of more. Maybe not everybody, but most people I know. And so to continue living that way, it's really out of fear and self-loathing. And what I try to help people see is if you can actually create the life you want, you're not going to want to escape it. And I didn't even bother to consider what I wanted to do with my life when it came time to make the big decisions like going to college or not going to college and all that stuff. I didn't even think about what I wanted. I was too busy doing what I thought I was supposed to do instead of even considering what I really wanted to do.
Do you think that that is a trap that a lot of people fall into just because when you're 17, 18 years old, uh, it's it's hard to conceptualize the idea of having such a strong sense of self at such a young age that you're not going to fall into the people pleasing part of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It makes me wonder how backwards things are where people are expected to kind of figure out the rest of their lives at 18, 19, 21, when you haven't built up a sense of who you are yet and you haven't built up a sense of what the rest of the world is like yet.
Well, to me, this kind of ties into a lot of the conversations that we have about what's going on in the world and in this country, in our society. There's a quote by Krishnamurti where he said, "It is no measure of good health to be well adjusted in a profoundly sick society."
I've heard that quote before.
Yeah. And I believe that. And I think one of the things that drives me crazy about addiction is we keep doing this. Well, let's help this person. Let's fix one person or one family, when really the problem's a lot bigger than that. And this kind of is where the manhood stuff that you and I have talked about comes in, because we are conditioned, I think all of us, but especially males, we are conditioned to resist our emotional experience. We're conditioned to pretend it's not there. So if I'm doing that, and and I have this passion to go be an artist or whatever, and I feel that really strongly. Well, you're told you're supposed to turn that off.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not supposed to listen to that. And then you have a chorus of people saying, oh, that's not practical. You're not going to make money that way. And we live in this society where so much is based on image, what car you drive, how you dress, who you hang out, all that stuff, you
What you
know?
look like to other people.
Right. Image bullshit really is what it is. So I believe that the whole thing is just one big setup to fail. And I've said at times, if I was going to create a society that I could control, probably the first thing I would do is to tell all the men to just ignore whatever it is you're feeling, because then you're not going to fight it. You know, your anger, you're going to end up channeling somewhere else, at the person down a couple notches on the ladder than you, or social class, whatever it is. I think we're really screwed up as a society.
I mean, we are. I don't think there's any way around that.
Yeah. And one of the things I experience coaching guys now, especially if they lean left like you and I do, is so we are grieving what's happening in this country. We're in a state of mourning because it's such a shock that we could be here, where people seem not all that worried about what happens to democracy. Like, I could have never imagined that as a kid, or even 15 years ago, that we'd be tolerating what we're tolerating now. And I have these young guys who are learning how to establish and maintain healthy boundaries to manage the intimacy in their lives with family members and all that. And most of the time, what they're hearing is, you just got to stop watching the news. You got to quit paying attention. There's nothing we can do. You just got to quit paying attention to all that stuff. So essentially, they're invalidating what they're feeling and saying, you shouldn't even be thinking about that. You shouldn't even worry about that.
Right.
When what's going on really is they are profoundly sad.
I mean, I've even had that. Like, I remember fairly recently my mom being like, you can't change anything, so you might as well just kind of get, I'm paraphrasing, you might as well
Yeah.
just kind of get used to it.
Well, and since the last election, I've had to adjust.
As we all have.
My wife and I talk about this because we're both kind of freaked out. And right now, she's probably more freaked out than I am because she is an immigrant with a green card and all that. She's legal status, legal to work, all that stuff. We're about halfway there for her to become a U.S. citizen. And it's just scary,
Right.
the stuff that's happening. It's really weird.
How do you, with everything that's going on, and just on a regular basis, and I feel like anytime I speak to somebody who is a coach or a therapist, and I've wanted to ask this question of my own therapists, but it feels weird, in times of tumult societally, but even being able to hold a container for multiple people's internal mess on a regular basis. How do you do all that and still keep your wits about you?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of detachment that you have to be able to practice, or else you can't do this kind of work, you know? And very early on, when I started doing this, after treatment, I went to a halfway house. I lived in a halfway house for like 15 months. Eventually, I became the resident manager there.
Wow.
And one of the guys relapsed, who I was really close to. And I remember talking to a therapist who did a group there, and I was beside myself, saying, what if I did this, or what if I did that differently? And she said, we just do what we do. We got to just focus on doing what we do the best we can and letting go of the outcome. We don't know what part of someone's story we're going to appear in. It might not be the end where they get better. It could be the middle of it. But if we do what we do and do it well, maybe when they get to that point, they'll remember something we said. And that was a really good lesson for me to have to, I can't make you or anybody else change. I can share my experience, I can make suggestions and all that, but at the end of the day, I can't do it for you, like
Right.
so, and I think growing up in a dysfunctional home with the stuff going on that I had going on, I was used to a certain amount of sort of troubled energy and knew how to navigate through that, through crises and all that stuff. And I actually I'm one of those people who's a little more calm when something crazy's going on and I have to be able to make a decision with a clear head. I usually know what to do in those situations. But usually people will ask me, well, isn't it hard? Don't you like to listen to that kind of stuff all the time? It must be really, really hard. And I just don't see it that way. And I think part of it is because I enjoy conversations like this. I hate small talk, but if you want to tell me your story, I'm here for it. I'll listen. And because I want to connect, I want to connect. And that's what sobriety has given me, the understanding that this is how we connect, by sharing our emotional experience with somebody else, how we deepen connection. So, what I wanted from a bottle, I ended up getting from recovery.
And you get from people.
Right.
It's the, again, connection, not to just
Mm-hmm.
regurgitate your word, but I see that in myself because connection is the thing that I desire the most.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually been thinking about that quite a bit recently in terms of sex, where, I spent my 20s and 30s being a hoe. Like, there's no
Mm-hmm.
way around that. I was very, 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 very promiscuous. And as I'm turning the corner on 50, I'm thinking back on this stuff and I'm like, was I looking for sex? Was I looking for an orgasm? Was I looking for, that feeling? Or was I looking for the feeling that you get when you really connect with somebody that is not necessarily inclusive of sex? And I think I was looking for some of both, but the greater feeling was that I was looking to connect with people and I didn't know how to connect with people. And sex seemed to be the easiest and most abundant means by which
Mm-hmm.
I could facsimile some sort of connection.
I mean, just going back to the idea of how we're trained to disregard our emotional experience. And, emotions are the currency of connection. That is how we connect with other people on a
I love
deep
that.
level. It really is, and you think about it, you go through some of the hardest things in life or the most difficult conversations. And if the other person is capable of showing up there with you, you get closer. That's what happens.
Absolutely.
So we live in this society where especially men are trained not to feel anything. We're trained not to connect with ourselves or anybody else. And, but the sort of the misogynist bullshit we get is, sex is great. That's the one place where we can channel that energy. And it's acceptable and encouraged and taboo as well to some extent.
Sure.
It's okay for guys to do that. And so that's the only way we know how to connect, that it's acceptable to connect. So, of course, we're doing it for reasons we don't really understand. When, when we just want that acceptance, that unconditional, complete acceptance, where someone allows us in that closely to have that kind of experience, that's what we want. The connection that's necessary for that act to be possible is what we want. Now, it feels good too.
Yeah.
But, one thing that I really just think is complete bullshit, and I've written about this a little bit, is this idea that if a guy doesn't orgasm frequently enough, he's going to go crazy or something.
Clearly not
Absolute
science.
bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. But as a heterosexual man, we benefit from that belief. Like you think of all the women you meet who they have sex not really because they want to, but like that's their job, and
Hmm.
and the guy is guilt tripping her because you're teasing me, I got blue balls, all that, which is just such nonsense.
Or
Yeah.
there's the threatening part of it, which is like, oh, if you don't give me what I want when I want, then I'm gonna go out and get it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's guilt tripping.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not love. That's the thing.
Absolutely
That
not.
is not love.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of stuff that I want to help men understand. I think I deep down probably knew this on some level, but I've learned a lot in my adult life about how to show up as a man. And that all kind of started with being married, becoming a father, and getting into couples counseling and beginning to understand how I wasn't showing up. And as a man, as a human being, as a partner, I wasn't being real. I was acquiescing. I was just agreeing, going back to that thing about preventing abandonment. If I'm not too much of a problem, then she won't leave.
Right.
And so that fear kept me from showing that person who I really was, what I really wanted, what I really expected. And I could just kind of look at it like she's being a pain in the ass and be resentful. But in truth, I wasn't being honest. I wasn't showing up completely. So when I started to see that kind of stuff, then I started reading about all the manhood sort of stuff and beginning to understand that part of myself better. And then it's just kind of gotten weirder over the last 10 or 15 years with, you know, all this talk about masculinity. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that we would be better off if the words masculine and feminine just didn't even exist in our lexicon, because by definition, it's comparison. We're comparing ourselves to other people, and you know, comparison is the thief of joy,
That is
right?
correct. That is correct.
And so when I went through this divorce and started to see how I was showing up with all this passive energy in my marriage, and I wasn't able to get what I wanted out of the relationship, I kind of went on this little quest of what does it mean to be a man? What does it really mean to be a man? And I would talk to people about it and read about it. And, ultimately, what I concluded is if you ask people what it means to be a man, you'll get some consistent answers. Be a provider, be responsible, that kind of stuff. Depending on what your family is like and what kind of morals you've had instilled in you, be honest. That was a big one in my family. You be honest, you don't cheat. Men don't do that. Real men don't do that. But it's really subjective. And, you think about when you hear people in the world saying he needs to man up, or he just needs to quit, grow up and be a man, or, and
Grow a pair of balls.
right,
Stop being
all
a
that
pussy.
stuff.
Don't be a bitch.
I
All of those
mean,
things.
it's weaponized. And in terms of what it actually means to me as a male, it's a moving target because everybody has their own ideas of what it really means. And so, what the conclusion I reached eventually is the real question that I need to be able to answer in order to feel adequate as a man, secure in my manhood, personhood, is the question is not what does it mean to be a man? It's what does it mean for me to be a man?
Really
How
great
do
way
I
to put
need to
that.
show up in the world in order to feel secure and feel confident? And I think the other stuff, the masculinity stuff, it's mostly just about control, you know?
It really is, and division. It's
Hmm.
it, I see that from so many different angles where it's like, what does it mean to be authentically male? What does it mean to be authentically black? What does it mean to
Hmm.
be authentically queer? And the reality is that it's all subjective. We all can only be ourselves,
Hmm.
and there is no true arbiter of what makes somebody any more or less than any of these characteristics that we have, which,
Hmm.
obviously shape our life experience, you know, but so much of it is really bullshit.
Hmm.
So it can be sort of frustrating to experience folks who haven't really given that a lot of thought and are just like, well, you should be blah 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 blah. And then it's like, why? Who says?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, that in and of itself is a whole mindset, right? When I was younger, a word that used to get thrown around a lot was conformity. And most people just go through life conforming and they don't think about what they want. They just do what they think they're supposed to do. And they don't ask a lot of questions. But that's not who I am. That's not the man that I am. I ask questions,
But
maybe too many sometimes.
no. What one thing that freaks me out, Tom, is how many of people who don't conform or who don't ask questions get to a point where they're 50, 60, 70, and they're like, oh shit, I have all these questions and
Hmm.
now no time to explore them or answer them or whatever it is.
Well, one of the terms I hate is midlife crisis, mostly because how it's weaponized and it's dismissive. Imagine being 55, 60 years old, maybe even only 40 years old, and you show up at a therapist's office, you're not happy in your marriage. You're realizing this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't the life that I want. And my time is becoming limited. If I'm going to have what I want, I need to do something. And you just have a therapist say, you're just having a midlife crisis.
Then you
Like,
need another therapist.
well, yeah, actually, there's a therapist, a colleague who, one of the things I did in my early 40s is I bought a Mustang. I wanted a Mustang when I was a teenager. Just something about them. I'm not even really a car guy, but most of my life I've either had a pickup truck or something you drive a family around in. And I wanted to honor myself and kind of honor my inner child a little bit. It was a time when I needed to get a vehicle, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it this time. And I worked at this facility where I would go to treatment facilities and interview clients there for them to move to our place for extended treatment. And so I'd go to this particular place where I'd known all the staff for a really long time. And this one therapist there saw me pull up in that car and she said, oh, I see. Midlife crisis.
Oh boy.
And then every time I'd go there, she'd bust my balls. Did you come in your midlife crisis? Did you drive your midlife? And it's like, yeah, okay. I mean, you have no idea what this car means to me. This isn't some stupid way for me to feel like a man. This is a way for me to affirm for myself that I deserve what I want and I deserve good things. This is me owning who I am as a human being and loving myself. That's why I got the car.
Right, right. You're treating yourself to something that you've always wanted, and now that you have the means to acquire it,
Mm-hmm.
you're doing it because you can.
Right. Right. And it's ironic to me that it's a therapist who gave me the most shit about
I
that.
mean, just because you got a degree doesn't mean you know what you're doing.
Yeah. And she actually is a really good therapist, but it's goes back to this idea of being well adjusted in a profoundly sick culture, you know? I
Right,
mean, the well adjusted Tom, well adjusted, quote unquote, might not have gotten that car. And he might not have gotten divorced. And he'd still be miserable.
right, right.
And if that's well adjusted, I'd rather be a crackpot or whatever you're going to call me.
Seriously,
Right.
like people can think I'm weird. I mean, I'm sure people do for a variety of things, but the reality is I could be a total conformist person and I would be the most unhappy fucking person
Mm-hmm.
in the entire world. because I'm not being true to myself. And authenticity gets thrown around as a buzzword these last 4 or 5 years, and it's turned into such an inauthentic word, which sucks. But I have a lot of respect for people who are like, I am going to be the most authentic version of myself right now, and then go ahead and follow through on that, whatever
What
that
I
means to them.
When we do that, we're at our best. That's
Absolutely.
when we're going to be at our best. When we use the gifts that we have, when we listen to that inner sort of navigator that we have that's telling, no, do this. And that's what feelings are, by the way. They inform us of what's going on around us and what we're experiencing and what that means to us. And I've used the analogy that going through life, ignoring your emotions is like having two perfectly good legs, but choosing to hop around all the time on one.
I like that analogy a lot.
Yeah.
I did want to ask two questions
Okay.
that have come to me over the course of actually of all of our conversations. One is, you come from a big family, and you come from a family with a lot of baggage, as most families do. I don't think your
Mhm.
family is any more unique than most others. What advice would you give to someone who is trying to set boundaries with family members who may be toxic? And I mean, I realize you don't have to have a big family to have toxic family members, you just have to have one. But what can we collectively do to draw boundaries there?
Well, I think, first of all, boundaries is another one of those words that gets thrown around a
Overused.
lot now.
Yeah.
It's overused and misunderstood. And, there's this whole sort of cliche that I don't want to do this, so I'm setting a boundary here. This person upset me, so I'm setting a boundary. And also, one of the things I see is that I think people believe that when they're establishing a boundary with someone in their life that they need to make some big announcement to them or something like that, when you usually don't. And so one of the things I've done is I created this, it wasn't my idea, but a therapist taught me, and I've used it with my clients a lot, what I call the boundaries blueprint, which is a series of concentric circles. And in the center is you and the things about you that only you know, and maybe your maker knows, and you're with yourself all the time. Nobody has more access to you than you. And
Mm,
then you go out a layer, and maybe it's your best friend, maybe it's your spouse. So they don't quite know the things that you know in that very center, but they know most of the stuff. And then the next layer out is maybe your siblings, maybe your parents. And so as it goes out, it's a way to visualize how you're managing intimacy in your life. And the big lesson where I learned about that tool and where I learned how I needed to see boundaries differently is I have this older brother who was extremely verbally and emotionally and sometimes physically abusive to me. And by this time I had moved to Florida where I got sober, and I would come back to visit my family every time I had a little vacation from work or whatever. And I'd always get my hopes up about connecting with him. Like, it's going to be great to spend time with my brother. I miss my brother. I want to be able to connect with my brother. And I'd paint this picture in my mind of, it's going to be great. We're going to have a good time. We're going to feel close. And what happened instead was what always happened. He was an asshole at some point. And then I would blame him and go through this cycle of being upset with him for a while and then re-engaging. And when this therapist introduced this tool to me, what he helped me see is that I was giving him access to me as if he belonged in one of those inner circles, when really the way he treated me, he belonged way out further from there. So it was actually me doing it to
mm.
myself. I was enabling that to happen. And that was a huge lesson. And that's what I've learned. And that's the first time I really learned to do those things. And to me, I think boundaries are usually more about what kind of energy we're bringing to a situation, how we carry ourselves, and what kind of space we need from other people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely.
Okay.
And my last question is, we are doing a very particular kind of work, but everybody can do this work.
Mhm.
How do we as guys show up for the guys around us? And I guess I should have thought this question out a little bit more fully, and just continue to be a container for the people around us. Like, how do we give ourselves and each other what we really want, which is the sense of connection, the freedom to be ourselves? Like, how do we counteract, particularly like a lot of this negative messaging that's going around right now, or show up for one another in a time like this?
Mm. Well, I did this post on Substack a few months ago that really ruffled some feathers. And it basically was, I just pointed out how this term toxic masculinity was sort of a lightning rod. The response to it was that's kind of when all this stuff that's turned into Andrew Tate and all that, that's kind of when it started.
Right.
When the American Psychological Association sent out a news release saying that we have new standards of practice for psychologists when treating men and boys, and it's based on this. And there was this paper where the term, it's not where toxic masculinity, where the term was coined, but it's where it became lingua franca.
Sure.
And then it's when Fox News like went on and said they're destroying manhood and all that, when it really started to happen. But the post that I wrote was about, what if instead of using that term, the American Psychological Association instead described it as emotional immaturity? Because the behaviors we're talking about that we describe as toxic masculinity, emotional immaturity must exist for those behaviors to take place.
Right.
And it
And
might not have turned so many people off. So it's a long way of saying, I think first we learn emotional literacy and emotional intelligence, and we learn how to be connected to ourselves. And I think the first big part of that is to stop avoiding our emotional experience, stop hiding from it, stop distracting ourselves from it. And I also think that in terms of all this masculinity and how emotions fits into the picture, I think at some point we're going to have to recognize, no, maybe I'm not being sensitive. Maybe you're numb. Maybe
say
you're being
more.
a meathead. I'm not being a pussy. You're being a fucking meathead. And when I say that, I think we're going to have to fight. At some point, guys like you and I, and the guys who care and want men to love themselves and have happy lives, are going to have to fight for it and stand up for it and call other men out on their bullshit when we see it, when we have the opportunity. And I'm sure you do that in some ways in your groups that you do.
I try.
If you're doing a group with other men and somebody trusts you and you see something like that, that's the best time to call it out, because
Right.
they trust you and they know you care. Right. So, yeah, I think there's a lot that we can do, but it really starts with each of us as individuals being healthy and then modeling that for other people. One of the conclusions I've come to is, I was born in 73, so I grew up in the 80s. And when I was a little kid, they were still saying things like, Tom, women really can do math.
Oh, God.
Because the conventional wisdom before then was that guys are better at math, women can't really do math. There's still all this sexist stuff, even worse than now. So, now, since feminism came about, which now we got all these guys saying feminists hate men and they want to destroy America and all that bullshit, when really all they want is equity, which they deserve.
Right.
But when that started to come around, guys like me didn't have healthy older men who understood this stuff to be able to model it for us. So we've been winging it. Like I've been winging it my whole life until more recent years. So I haven't wanted to treat women like a misogynist, but all those messages were still embedded in my operating system. And I had to learn over time to tease that stuff out, that it was flawed in the first place. And I think it is getting better. Like I have a 19-year-old son who, I think it's fair to say, one of the things that bothered him most about this last election going the way that it did is its implications for women, because he loves women. And we've gone back in time,
Right.
is what we've done. When I was his age, if that's not the first thing I would have thought about.
Sure. And I would also add that uh this podcast is called Detoxicity, so the basis for even the name of this podcast is reversing toxic masculinity.
Right.
But I think one thing people get wrong about toxic masculinity is that they think toxic masculinity can only be practiced by men, which is incorrect. Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, you just think of all the trad wives on Instagram and all the women out there talking about how they need to be submissive, and if the man's not dominant, there's something wrong with him. I mean, that's only attractive to somebody because they grew up that way and
right,
that's what's they're supposed to be attracted to. That's not real.
right, right.
They're
Or
conditioned that way.
right. Or even they see this to an extent in the boardroom, who think that by adopting really bad traditionally masculine behaviors they can get ahead. That's the thing as well. So it's not just guys who have to do the work. I think it's a system that we have to check and reverse, as opposed to just something that half the population has to
Mm.
kind of take charge of and fix themselves. It takes everybody. And again, just the idea of toxic masculinity in name would indicate that it is just a male problem, but it is clearly
Mhm.
not a male problem. So I think there's
Yeah,
a
well, the whole internalized misogyny and homophobia and all
right,
that.
right,
The other thing I didn't mention is that older brother who emotionally abused me was calling me faggot, faggot, faggot over and over and over and over again. And I mean, I knew I wasn't gay, but it was
and
emasculating, and because of my internalized homophobia, I was ashamed.
right. My thinking is always that people who lean really, really hard on projecting on other people's homosexuality have some internal issues that they need
Yeah.
to work out regarding their own sexuality.
Yeah, yeah, if nothing else, fear.
Yeah,
And a lot of times it's just ignorance.
I think it's fear of self, and it's come up again and again. Like, look at all of the major anti-gay legislators who get caught with their pants down in a public bathroom or something like that.
Yeah,
I do think that the people who are the biggest homophobic bullies are the people that are wrestling internally with the fluidity of their own sexuality.
they're projecting their own
Check.
shame out
Yeah,
onto the world. That's what they're doing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Big, big shout out to Tom, not only for being a great podcast guest, but also for being a really good friend, and also just for the work that he does, which is so, so important. You can find him on Substack. You can find him on Instagram at The Path to Authenticity. And you can find him online at tomgentry.net. That is TOMGENTRY.net. Thanks again, Tom. Really appreciate it and really appreciate you. Hope to have you back.